All right, web design students, one more thing this week, background images. So we have lots of options when it comes to backgrounds in general. We can do patterns. We can do photographs. Either way, the HTML and CSS work the same basic way. We already saw that we can do background color. Let's switch to patterns. So patterns consist of a small image repeated across and or down to create a pattern. Examples of nice patterns you can find at subtlepatterns.com, and I've used one for this example that we're going to do in a second here. For photographs, the same principles as patterns apply, but there are usually a few more options when you're using photographs. Photographs will repeat like patterns, but you can control this so it looks good so you don't get a lot of things like just a bunch of tiles that don't look good together. So let's talk about background images. Background image CSS selector. It's URL, whether it's a pattern or a photo. And you can use background image CSS selector to create color gradients. So let's try it. We can use background image to create linear and radial gradients. So let's go to our code. And we're back in our CSS. Maybe I want to have a red to blue gradient going down with the length of the page. So we can use background image. And then you can see in Atom, they give you some auto completes. So you can do linear gradient, radial gradient, even repeating linear gradients. I'll just do linear gradient here. And in the parentheses, let's start with red, and it'll transition to blue. So if we save this back to our example website, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we've got a red background. If we scroll down, it gradually changes to a blue background. So that's linear gradient. We can switch this up to a radial gradient, and I'll show you what that looks like. Save this, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now it starts red on the inside and gradient out to blue. So that's nice. We'll get rid of this for now. Now let's go back to our presentation. Now that we've done gradients, both linear and radial, let's do a background pattern. So back in our code, background image, we want URL. Now, my background image that I want to use is in the IMG folder. And since this CSS file is in the CSS folder, I have to do something special to get it out of the CSS folder and into the IMG folder to correctly write the path to this bubble thing. So to do that, it's 2 dots to go up a level to the public_HTML folder, and then back down into my image folder. And I want bubble.png. So this is how you write it. If you're writing a CSS in a style.css file inside of a CSS folder, you can't just write IMG because there's no IMG folder in your CSS folder. So 2 dots and a slash will bring you up one level, and then back down using img/bubble png, which is the name of the file. Save this, back to our example, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And here's that bubble pattern that I had saved in that folder. So that's a nice way to put a little visual interest into your pages. So back in our code, we can do a few things to control how this looks. So underneath this, we can do background repeat. Let's say we do no repeat. Let's see what this looks like. Back in our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now there's only one version, one instance of this background image. Let's go back. Maybe I only want to repeat it in the X direction. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we only have it repeating once in the X direction. Similar concept for Y. Repeat Y. 3, 2, 1, refresh. And it only repeats down the side in the Y direction. Go back to our presentation. So you saw the background repeat. There are other ways to position your image, including background position. So something like 0% is in the corner here, or you can do position keywords like center, center, or left center, or right center, depending on how you want to put it around your web page. I don't usually use this, so I don't have a use for background position often. So now that we've done that, let's try a photograph. So if you remember in my mock-up, I had a background image of just this part here. So we'll just use that for our example. So instead of the bubbled PNG, I have my portrait there. So I will switch this to, ooh, no, we don't want to use that. I don't want this background image, so I'll just delete this. And then in my mockup, here is the about div. So let's go down here to the about div, start my background image selector. I want URL. Again, 2 dots and a slash, go up a level, then IMG, and then picture there. So if we save this, we can go back to our example website, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now here's a piece of that picture. Don't really see everything. So there are ways to control this in CSS. Even if we shrink the browser, you still don't see very much of it. So let's control this using CSS. Back into our CSS here. Now we can do things. So we can do background size. We can do auto or contain or cover. I'll show you both. So let's start with contain, show you what contain looks like. Back to our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now, since we used contain, it's fully contained within the size of the div here. Now, it repeated 3 times because we didn't tell it to stop repeating. So we can go in and fix that here. Background, repeat, no repeat, and then we should have in our browser just one instance of it. But that's not what I want it to look like, even if I were to shrink it. Only in this sense, in this size, it shows up the way I like it to in my mockup. Here, this is not ideal. So there are ways to fix that so that you can see it over the entire width of your div. So back in our code, thing to do is instead of contain, we can do cover. So background size cover, and then back into our picture here, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we kind of see it fill in more properly. actually see it better here, like so. But for now, that's what we have in terms of background image. Now there's a few more things we can do with our divs. My mockup had this here. We can do some styling in CSS to get closer to that. So let's do that now, just for example's sake. I think what I want to do is go into my HTML and add a div to that text. So back in here in my mockup, here I have a box with this text in it inside this about div. So I'm going to add one more div to this here to box this up. Or to my HTML, scroll all the way back up to my about, and here I'm going to add a new div to contain this. Let's call this, let's just call it box. All right. So using CSS, I can control box to fit inside that about div, start a new one, box, and maybe I want to do, we want background, color, RGBA. I want a little bit of white background, but not totally white. So we'll do half. Three, two, one, refresh. Now we've got a little bit of a nicer background for this to see the text a little more. Maybe I'll bump it up a little bit. 0.8. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now it's a little more readable. It's all jammed up in here. Maybe we'll move it a little bit. It's back into my code. Do some padding. Maybe we'll do 5%. We've been going with 5%. 3, 2, 1, refresh. And got a little bit here. Actually, it's probably a little too much. I'll back it down to like 3%. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Yeah. I don't want it to be so wide, so let's add some width selector to this. %. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now I've made it not quite as wide as the div, but now it's over to the left. I want it in the center because my mockup had it more in the center. So what we can do is go back to our code here and use something called margin 0 auto, which will center that div inside that other div. So back into my browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now I have this box div centered inside the about div. And if we shrink this down, it looks a little more like our mockup here. So that's working. Let's go back to our presentation. Finish that up. A few more attributes to know of. Background size. We've talked about this. The default setting for background size is auto. It retains its original size and it gets clipped if it's too big for the container. You can set a horizontal size using pixels and vertical with px in your background size. I've never used this. I've never had a need to do something like this in a web page. You can also use percentages, but this can mess with the aspect ratio, so probably shouldn't use it. Here, this example is 100%, 20%. Cover we saw. This resizes the image to make sure the container is fully covered. This is what we ended up. Contain will resize the image to make sure the image is completely visible inside the container. So at the beginning, you had repeated instances of my background image. Like you see here, it repeats unless you do other things to it. This is not an ideal look anymore, so probably wouldn't use contain as much as you would background size cover. There's other attributes like background attachment, like scroll, so the background image will scroll with the page. This is the default. You can also do fixed so that your background doesn't move, but sometimes it'll clip off pieces of the image, so I don't use this that often. You can do things like determine where the background image starts using background origin. Is it on the inside edge of the border? Is it the outside edge of the content? You can get really specific with background origin. I've never really used this, but it is available. So background origin border box, the background image is underneath the border. So see this border here. You can see the background image underneath it. Padding box, the background image starts where the padding starts. This is the default. So if you don't do anything with background origin, your image starts where the padding starts, not where the border starts. Content box, the image starts at the edge of the content, not the edge of the border or the edge of the padding. So it's here where your content really starts. Background clip talks about where the image ends. So if this sounds confusing, it's a little confusing, but they just like to give you a lot of options. So border box, when you do background clip, is virtually identical to background origin border box. So it fills in the entire border. It's underneath the border. Padding box, the difference is where the image is clipped. Content box, again, the image is clipped again, but you can resize this using background origin. So there's lots of different options. Like here, the top row is different background origins and the bottom row is different background clips. So get really specific. Background color is a good backup to have in case your image doesn't work. Then you at least have some sort of visual interest if that's necessary. Other background things you can try on your own that's available to you, but we won't get into here. Multiple background images you can do. You can do knockout text like you would do like a clipping mask in Photoshop. This is very advanced. If you want to use a shorthand, you can add all these different options in it. So image, position, size, repeat, attachment, origin, clip, color. You can put that all into one shorthand or you can type it all out. It's really your preference, but know that you can do a shorthand that combines them all together if you want to save characters or something. All right.